Monday, the fifth plenum of the 19th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China opened here in Beijing. Well, the meeting is to assess the proposals for the 14th five-year plan for economic and social development, as well as future targets for 2035. So what topics are on the agenda? What challenges have been identified? And where does China see itself going in the next 5 years? To talk about these issues, I'm joined by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at the East China Normal University, and Stephen Rhodes, Senior Fellow at the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs at Yale University. Later, we'll be joined by Xiao Geng. He's the chairman of the Hong Kong Institution for International Finance. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So, John, topping the plenum of this CPC's Central Committee's meeting will be the drawing of the 14th five-year plan for economic and social development, as well as the target of 2035. Well, those are just the rough guidelines for China's economic development, not necessarily the roadmap. But do you think what will be the highlights of this plan?
Well, when we see this very detailed document, there will be many details in it. It's supposed to come, as we discussed, in the next party session, I guess, in 2 to 3 months, right? So we're going to talk about these things at that time. But I think via several speeches in the recent past, President Xi has already set the overall target, right? The overall target. And I think the overall target is very clear. That is to, according to his words, to construct systematically the socialist market economy, right? So this is the overall objective. And I think what really means, according to my interpretation, is that we're going to break through a set of targets we've already met in the past, the 13th five-year plan, in sort of in a little bit of a big way. Especially on the not just on the GDP side, but also in terms of the quality of growth, governance system, people's quality of life, these things. So I think will be, very interesting to see the many details, many targets set by the various ministries under the government wing.
Yeah. And Stephen, when you observe China's economy, what do you think should be the priorities and challenges for the economic planners?
Well, look, I think the fifth plenum meets amidst a global economy and a Chinese economy that has gone through its largest shock in the modern period. The Chinese economy is recovering nicely from the lockdown that led to a precipitous decline in the first quarter of this year. But the growth rate this year is going to fall well below 3%, possibly even below 2%. And the average growth rate over the five-year period for the 13th five-year plan will fall probably around 5.7, 5.8%, which is well below the target laid out 5 years ago. So China is not an oasis in an otherwise difficult global economic environment. I think the imperative needs to be on figuring out how to cope with growth problems as they arise very seriously this year and potentially in the future.
And there is another factor to consider, that is the U.S. strong desire to decouple from some of the sectors in China. Will that also bear down on China's economy, Stephen?
Yeah, it certainly will, and it already has. It's created a shortfall, not just in Chinese exports to the United States, but in China's broad technology sector, which is so heavily dependent on critical components from the United States. So this is a very challenging development for China. The focus is on this sort of this new buzzword, dual circulation, but it's actually sort of a rehash of a strategic realignment that many of us have been looking at for years, where China draws greater dependence on domestic demand and on indigenous innovation. And so to the extent that the U.S. is squeezing that's a big challenge.
And Joseph, earlier Stephen mentioned dual circulation. We prefer to use the term double development dynamic, which means we rely both on domestic activities, economic activities, and the international economic cycle. But do you understand why there is a policy shift?
Yeah, as Stephen noted, this grows out of several efforts that were already underway that had previous names like rebalancing. They had correlated policies like Made in China 2025, and those those policies had faced significant headwinds internationally. But you know, the interesting thing is these same international pressures, primarily from the United States, had but followed secondly now by COVID, had really pushed China into a defensive position, a reactionary position that had sort of stymied these reforms. But we've kind of reached a tipping point now where the tailwind has turned into a headwind. In other words, this has now pushed China to really, you know, sort of bite the bullet and really commit itself to these efforts that had been interrupted. So with the dual dynamic or the double dynamic versus whether we use these two terms, you know, still in the West we're still using the dual circulation term. It's basically, as noted, to try to promote self-sufficiency, but at the same time try to maintain exports as much as possible over the next 15 years.
Self-sufficiency, that's a word a lot of people are talking about. Is it really beneficial for China in the long term, John? Because China used to enjoy fast economic development because we open up to the rest of the world. Can we turn back to our domestic market slowly?
The problem is that we in China doesn't have a choice here. For companies like Huawei, for example, doesn't have a choice at all. We would rather be in a situation where there's international cooperation. For example, there's a division of labor, there's cooperation of telecommunications community, for example. American companies can export, you know, semiconductor chips from Qualcomm, a slew of other companies. We would rather be in that kind of a cooperative environment. But the problem is that, you know, there's this president in the White House that's holding China hostage. That we are forced into a corner. We're forced to rely on development of indigenous technologies. And we had a history, basically. We have a history of being quite successful to do that when we are cornered. We were cornered actually in the 1960s by the Russians, and we recovered quite nicely. So it is not our choice, but it's something we're ready for it. I think it's, you know, we're speaking of the decoupling from the United States. I think it's not just China being sort of pushed and sort of suffer from this relationship. In all aspects, I would argue that the trade war started by President Trump has failed in every aspect from the U.S. perspective. And look at the trade deficit that's been enlarged. Look at the structural changes that the USTR has been pushing. I think none of these objectives, so-called structural changes that are not in China's agreement, have been adopted so far. The things we've been doing are already something we're planning to do anyway. If you look at the, you know, what American consumers are paying for these tariffs, you know, there's numerous studies out there that are saying that the American consumers are paying for it. On average, each household is paying $800 per year. And I think President Trump is going to pay a political price for that. I mean, look at the latest poll in the state of Iowa. Iowa used to be a solid red state, a GOP state, right? But now the polls are showing that, you know, Vice President Biden is leading just a little bit. So, you know, God knows what's going to happen to Iowa. And if Iowa is lost to President Trump, he's gone. So I think ultimately it's the American consumers are suffering, American economy is suffering, the farmers in Iowa, the soybean farmers are suffering. So in all aspects, I would say this trade war started by President Trump has failed in every single aspect he is trying to achieve.
So that begs the question, is China doing the right thing? Stephen, are you concerned that that might be overcompensation because those external pressures may ease or may disappear from the U.S.? There'll be policy changes down the road. Are we over-preparing for decoupling?
Look, I think there's no downside to having a more balanced approach to economic growth, and China did what it had to do following the reforms and opening up of Deng Xiaoping. It relied heavily on investment and export-led demand, but that had its limit. And as the world pushes back from the standpoint of deglobalization, decoupling, and a series of major shocks to global economic activity, beginning with a global financial crisis, actually beginning with the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, the global financial crisis, and now the COVID shock, there is a clear need for any economy, especially China, to diversify its sources of growth. That doesn't mean turning off the external export-led piece of its economy, but deriving more sustenance from internal private consumption driven by indigenous innovation. And if you don't do that, then the warnings of what we economists call the middle income trap will kick in. If you don't push to more of an internal indigenous innovation economy, then your growth rate will begin to falter, as most developing economies do when they reach the middle income level.
But Stephen, the question is diversify at what cost, and where do we draw the line between domestic and international circulation?
Look, by the metrics we use in the West, household consumption in China is less than 40% of its GDP. That's the lowest consumption share of any major economy in the world. That number needs to be at least 10 percentage points higher. So this is not a time to worry about drawing the line. This is a time to put the pieces in place that will drive middle-class Chinese consumers to be more active in generating growth for their economy.
And Joseph, there is also the supply question. In light of the growing restrictions on Chinese access to U.S. tech, the Chinese government is looking to keep the homegrown tech for itself, especially R&D and expertise. But is high-tech self-sufficiency even possible in a globalized environment? And what should China do?
Well, we know that there are several efforts underway, some starting several years ago to identify potential choke points, particularly as what some people call this tech Cold War has been advanced by the Trump administration. And to be honest with you, there are a lot of people who are quite concerned that China is going to be cut off from vital tech supplies. My position is a bit more optimistic. I've visited the various campuses at Huawei. I have seen the tremendous amount of companies and you know, from the private enterprises in China, but also public initiatives that have aimed to remove these choke points and to develop local capacity. But this ties into your previous question, and I think that the bottom line is this is really going to put pressure on Europe. You know, the U.S. We don't know where it's going to go in the next 4 years. We don't know if Trump's going to be reelected. It looks like Biden will come in, but Biden hasn't talked that much about foreign policy. He's tried to focus on domestic affairs. So we don't really know where that's going to go, but the general trend seems to be negative between the U.S. and China. And the real question is, if Biden comes in, will he be more effective at pressuring Europe to decouple technologically? By potentially pushing Europe out of Chinese markets, intermediate goods, other goods that Europe wants to sell, and by building that self-sufficiency in China, by also removing some of these choke points and increasing local capacity, domestic capacity, it gives Beijing a point of leverage where it can then negotiate bilaterally or with the EU more broadly on how those countries or that market might intersect with China's tech sector. So I think it builds capacity, but it also creates new incentives for these other countries to try to do business with China on China's terms.
I think, Stephen, that's why the planners here in Beijing are having a difficult time. We don't know whether next administration will have a different China policy in terms of economy and trade. What do you think?
Well, there's a lot of speculation, and I'd say a couple things in that regard. The issues that have been put on the table initially by the Trump administration in terms of the structural challenges of technology transfer, intellectual property rights, industrial policy, cybersecurity, those issues are going to remain. What is going to change, and this is important, I think, will be the approach that U.S. policymakers use in dealing with those issues. If President Trump is reelected, then it's pretty much more of the same, overnight Twitters, tariffs, and very negative characterizations of China as the greatest existential threat since the former Soviet Union. If Vice President Biden is elected, and nobody's going to venture a guess, I take the point that, there's sentiment shifting in places like Iowa, but I'd have to say that, Florida and Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin are far more important than Iowa. I think you'll get a more disciplined approach from Vice President Biden's administration. He will not back down on the structural issues, but he'll choose different ways to deal with it. The phase one framework of President Trump will disappear in a heartbeat, and there'll be more of a multilateral approach in dealing with broad issues like cybersecurity, climate change, and returning to market access through the framework of a bilateral investment treaty. These are much more effective ways in dealing with issues that are disconcerting with respect to U.S.-China relationships right now.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Stephen. John, that's why when we were talking about the next 5-year plan or the targets for 2035, it seems we should have two versions. Can America go more reasonable approach, or it will go down a more confrontational approach? That will mean totally different things for Chinese economic planners.
Well, I think that's a minor issue. I think we're going to be on course on what we should do. I think, who's actually taking over the White House is a minor matter. I think, there's a kind of a consensus, as many people have pointed out, that, American foreign policy vis-a-vis China is going to be constrained by this consensus. And I think, in a way, Vice President Biden is going to be quite different. But it's actually I think yesterday there's an interview. He was asked who is going to be the largest threat to the United States, and he said it's Russia. And then second question is, what about China? And he said that China is a competitor, okay? And if we compete on terms that sort of get into a vicious cycle, we could be something else. But that's his overall message, is that if we control this competition, at least we can live together as competitors. And I think that's a fairly appropriate and quite accurate characterization of the relationship. And I think that it's also a healthy characterization, I think. Whether Washington is going to this or do that, I think mostly China is going to be doing its own things. And overall, you asked the question previously about the emphasis on domestic economy versus export markets, and I need to point out that even before President Trump started this trade war, even before the pandemic hits China and the rest of the world, China's economy's share, the exports portion of China's GDP.
It's been shrinking.
It's been shrinking. Yeah, it's been shrinking. At the highest point, it used to be like something like 25%. Now it's like 17%, and this is happening well before President Trump's trade war. So I think for I always point out this, for any advanced economies, the trend has always been the case that the share of the export sector as part of the percentage of GDP has been shrinking. I mean, the United States something like 5%, I believe. And I think we're going to go down that path. I think China's exports portion is going to continue to shrink as part of GDP as this whole pie keeps growing. As Stephen has pointed out, that to get over the middle income trap, certainly domestic consumption is very important. And I think it's indeed happening. The middle class in China is expanding. People are willing to spend more money, as you can see from the latest, what is it called? No, I'm sorry, the long weekend, right? We have half of the population in China.
Golden Week holiday.
Yeah, Golden Week holiday, right. So half of the population is traveling, people are spending money. So I think we're getting there. It's a matter of time. I think, the engine of economic growth has its own inertia. It's going to go on its own, and we're going to see 5%, maybe even 6% growth for the next few years. It's not going to go down that fast. It's going to keep cranking, and sooner or later we're going to reach there.
And Professor Xiao, I know that you have some opinions about China's economic structure and growth targets. What would it be like in the next 5 years and next decade? Is it going to be slower than 5%? And what will be the main engine for China's economy?
Well, the growth rate will definitely slow down, largely because of the population issue. And but the quality of growth will improve a lot. In the next few.
Whoops, we have lost Professor Xiao there. I want to throw this question to you, Joseph. What is your estimate of the biggest engine for China's economic growth down the road in 5 years?
Well, we've talked about avoiding the middle income trap, and above all, that requires dealing with some way to stimulate and grow domestic consumption. And so I think if you're really going to try to sustain what the target right now, I think, is that was announced was 5% growth rates averaging for the next 15 years. That may be difficult. I think that we've seen here a global crisis in the form of the pandemic. We have uncertainty vis-a-vis the United States, but we also have the problem of future pandemics. These things are accelerating with global warming. We don't know what's coming down the line. China may be emerging as a global super health power, and it may be in a position to better absorb these shocks. But on the other hand, I'm not that concerned about a middle income trap. And so as a result, I'm not so concerned about it not being able to get close to those 5% growth rates, because it has the capacity to reform its legal and political and economic systems. It has the ability to resist foreign efforts to contain it. And it has the ability to innovate and to drive innovation forward. Wow. And we see all of these factors coming to a head in the new 5-year plan with the national infrastructure and the rebalancing strategies.
Talking about the accelerators, a lot of people are saying technology will be the biggest one, and China is taking the lead in many new technology areas, for example, digitization of finance, 5G, and big data. And Joseph, do you think China will probably move ahead because of the buttresses from those new technologies?
In fact, something that I talk a lot about in other media is that I think, depending on how we measure it, and it's kind of a difficult term to assess, but I think by several measures, China is what we might call the most advanced technological society in the world today in terms of how tech is being used, how digitalization is being used, finance, banking. It maybe has something comparable in South Korea, but just the sheer scope and size of China and its capacity for growth far overshadows what we see in South Korea. So I think that indeed probably no other government is embracing AI and digitalization and e-governance the way China has. E-commerce, e-banking, all of these things are moving ahead at speed. The capacity to roll out 5G. I know from my contacts at Huawei that they've basically figured out 6G at this point, but it's going to be another 5 or 6 years before that can start being rolled out. So I think China is really surging ahead right now on technological fronts, and that's terrified people in Washington and even Europe.
So, John, if China is surging ahead, China needs followers and need a big market, not necessarily the Chinese market, to have a snowball effect. But are we getting there?
Well, in terms of our international markets, I think the current statistics shows that the largest market is the Southeast Asia market. The ASEAN market is our largest exports market, followed by the European Union and then the United States. But U.S. market is actually, not that big. I mean, it represents like, 2% of China's GDP, basically. We have our traditional markets, and if you look at the areas, the geographic locations of Chinese companies' major operations, they're actually mostly in the third world. For example, in Southeast Asia, in Southern Asia, in Africa, for example, in South America, these are typically, very difficult markets where, Western firms haven't really tapped into.
You think China is having
and China is, for example, just look at Africa. China is, pushing very heavily into Africa, right? Chinese companies doing, infrastructure projects, followed by, medium, small-sized business going there. We have a, fairly reliable market. I mean, as a matter of fact, the sector of exports growth that sees the fastest growth is actually the countries that are engaged in the Belt and Road Initiative. Right? I mean, they've been growing very fast. So I think it's indeed happening. I don't want to de-emphasize the importance of the traditional Western markets in Europe and U.S. But now, I think there's one very important reason is that a large portion of China's exports is actually associated with foreign companies, multinational companies operating in China. That includes a lot of American companies, right? I'll give you a wonderful example. Tesla, they're building cars here in Shanghai, right?
I just visited their gigafactory.
They are now exporting cars to Europe from the Shanghai factory. Can you believe that, right? So, this is a perfect example to show that American companies can indeed succeed here in China, and they can supply to the rest of the world as well.
Let's try to talk to Mr. Xiao on the line via phone. Mr. Xiao, if China wants to move ahead with full steam, what are the risks that we should guard against, you think?
Well, I think the risk is actually, how to maintain continuously the openness to the outside world, because in terms of innovation, you have to innovate at the frontier of the world, and so China is key, for China to continue to connect closely with the global economy, and that's really what made China successful through the global supply chains, those interactions. That's, I think, the key.
In the past 5 years, we talked a lot about the financial risks, deleveraging, destocking. Do you think those concerns should remain in the upcoming years?
I don't really concern too much about the financial risk, because the Chinese saving rates are extremely high, and the net asset, in China, both in the household sector and in the government sector, are pretty decent. There are some companies, which they have pretty high leverage, but on the whole, this is actually consistent with the global, experience. When the economy is growing very high, some companies will have high leverage. So on the whole, China has a very solid, financial balance sheet, and also profitability is pretty high, now. And you can actually see foreign investors are coming to China, the recent months. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Xiao, and thank you, Joseph. Thank you, John. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.